On a normal day, a young couple moved into their new apartment and found an old refrigerator left behind by the landlord. While Rob was fascinated by it, Gail was not impressed. When Rob opened the freezer, they found a tiny mammoth frozen inside and soon discovered a tiny civilization living on the ice. They were amazed by the tiny people in their rapidly changing world. One normal afternoon in the city, a young couple was moving into their new, beautiful apartment. They had plenty of their own boxes to unpack, but they were surprised to discover that the landlord had left behind an old, funky refrigerator. Gail was not impressed at all, but Rob found it very interesting because this old model had the motor on top instead of underneath like modern models. Gail did not care and just agreed with whatever he said to humor him. Afterward, Gail took out a bottle of wine to share with her husband, and Rob excitedly opened the fridge to get ice. He discovered that the freezer was full of old, disgusting frost and compared it to Superman's Fortress of Solitude. After pulling with all his strength, he barely managed to get a small ice cube out of the freezer. The couple then shared a toast to celebrate their new life together. But before Rob could take a sip of his drink, he noticed something strange inside the ice cube. He picked it up to look at it more closely and asked Gail if he was imagining things. Gail also saw something, so she grabbed a magnifying glass to inspect it better. She confirmed that inside the cube was a tiny mammoth with several spears stuck in its body. Curious to see if there were more surprises, Gail opened the freezer again and quickly removed all the items left by the landlord. She was shocked by what she discovered. Rob joined her and confirmed that unbelievably, there was a tiny lost civilization living inside their refrigerator. Right there on the ice, there was an entire medieval city with tiny people living their daily lives, completely unaware of the two giants watching them like a movie. These tiny people moved incredibly fast as they continued building their city and working hard to make progress. Gail pointed out that this didn't make sense, saying it was an early medieval city, but woolly mammoths had died thousands of years before the medieval times. Rob didn't know much about history, so he just agreed to humor her. After that, Rob decided to bury the little frozen mammoth in a pot of dirt. He seemed really sad about it, and Gail tried to cheer him up by saying the tiny animal would make good fertilizer, but Rob thought it was too soon for jokes. Soon, their curiosity got the best of them, and they checked the freezer again, only to be shocked by what they found next. The tiny civilization had evolved at an incredible pace and was now experiencing the Industrial Revolution. There were factories, roads, and other buildings quickly being built all over the ice, filling the freezer with smoke. The couple had only been away for 10 minutes, but decades had passed for the tiny people. Gail realized that time moved much faster inside the freezer, and Rob felt disappointed when he understood that they had missed the Renaissance period. As Rob watched two little men sitting near a building under construction, he wondered if these tiny people saw him and Gail as gods. However, the two little men were actually making fun of the couple. In just a few seconds, the tiny civilization started changing once again. Now, modern buildings were being constructed at an incredible speed. Rob noticed things flying around and Gail realized they were airplanes. Then Rob noticed something odd and leaned in for a closer look. At that moment, a missile fell right in the middle of the city and exploded, blinding Rob and causing him to stumble backward until he fell to the floor. While screams could be heard coming from the freezer, Gail rushed to Rob's side to help calm him down, but he kept panicking, pointing out that actual nukes were going off inside their freezer. However, Gail couldn't take him seriously because his face had turned bright red like a tomato, which made her laugh. She handed him a toaster so he could see how ridiculous he looked. Inside the freezer, huge nuclear bombs kept exploding, and Rob noticed things getting worse. But the couple could only watch as the tiny civilization was consumed by violence, screams, and more explosions. Frustrated, Gail shut the freezer, saying people can't outgrow war in just a few minutes. Rob wondered what they should do, and Gail casually suggested they get pizza. Later that evening, the couple enjoyed their pizza while waiting patiently. Eventually, Rob couldn't handle it anymore and insisted they open the freezer again. Gail reminded him they might have to accept that the civilization didn't survive, but Rob went ahead and opened it anyway. To their surprise, the tiny civilization had transformed into a futuristic city, filled with bright lights and flying cars, which reminded Gail of Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz. Rob was amazed at how beautiful and advanced everything looked, and at that moment, a building popped up in front of them, which reminded Rob of an adult toy. A huge pyramid-like structure suddenly appeared in the center of the tiny city, growing taller as bridges connected it to other buildings to draw energy. However, the structure quickly transformed into a glowing diamond-shaped fort that became so bright it consumed the entire city before exploding. The explosion created a glow that looked like a star, sending beautiful streaks of light flying around the couple's kitchen, lighting up every corner. Rob and Gail watched in amazement, smiling as they formed a theory that the little people might have figured out how to travel through space and time. Afterward, the lights returned to the freezer, gathered into a glowing sphere, and then completely disappeared. Rob and Gail's smiles faded, turning to sadness and confusion. When Rob wondered if the little people would ever come back, Gail said it was unlikely. Feeling the need to move on, Rob unplugged the refrigerator, accepting that the little civilization was gone for good. Gail gave Rob a hug to comfort him before closing the freezer, deciding they were done for the day. The next morning, Rob made coffee and shared it with Gail. Even though they didn't speak, it was clear they couldn't stop thinking about the tiny civilization inside the freezer. Giving in to their curiosity, they opened it again and were shocked to see a cold mist coming out, even though it was still unplugged. To their even bigger surprise, there was now an ice age inside, with primitive Homo sapiens eating the bodies of massive ancient creatures. It seemed the tiny civilization hadn't disappeared but had reset and started from the beginning. Just then, a Tyrannosaurus Rex roared loudly and started chasing a primitive man, catching one in its huge mouth before going after another that had just fallen to the ground.